Welcome back to your A&P lab. How'd it go with the anatomical terminology? Remember, I am here to help you if you need it. Over the next couple of weeks, we will be focusing on developing an eye for tissues. The human body is made up of tissues and water, from our bones to our muscles to our blood. In this lab, you'll need to be able to identify the various major tissue types when you see them on a slide. You may be wondering why. Why do I need to be able to recognize these things? Well, if you can identify the elements of a body tissue, you can infer its function and what role it plays in a body organ. Also, if we understand body tissues, we can begin to predict the effects on the body when tissues are diseased or damaged. So your objectives for this video are to distinguish epithelial tissues from other tissue types by sight and to name the epithelial tissues. The key to identifying different types of human tissues under a microscope is to pay close attention to the types of cells in the tissue and the amount and characteristics of the extracellular matrix that surrounds them. The extracellular matrix is also called the ECM. If you're in this class, you've talked about cells, and you should have seen some in a book or maybe on a slide under a microscope. But let's review them super quickly. Cells are the smallest unit of life. There are trillions of them in your body right now. And every cell at some point has three components. A plasma membrane, which is kind of like the outer border of the cell. It's composed of phospholipid bilayer plus protein, and its main job is to control what enters and exits the cell. So you can see I've drawn a circle around the plasma membrane of this epithelial cell. Inside of the plasma membrane is a jelly-like substance composed of proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, nutrients, and minerals. This is called the cytosol, and suspended within the cytosol are organelles. Together, they make up the cytoplasm. And in this figure, the cytoplasm is this kind of light pink material that's just inside of the plasma membrane. Now, when we look at cells in a microscope, the most prominent organelle that we're going to see is the nucleus. And you'll hopefully recognize that these dark, kind of oval-shaped magenta structures are the nuclei for these cells. And since these are simple squamous epithelial cells, each cell has one nucleus. The cytoplasm, by the way, is the material that the nucleus is suspended in. Okay. Now, remember the job of the nucleus is to house the chromosomes of the cell. Except for the gametes, each cell has all of the chromosomes for a human organism. Now, for some cells, you may even see a darkly stained mass inside of the nucleus. That's the nucleolus. Okay, that's the nucleolus, and it's responsible for RNA synthesis. So again, we're looking at cells in this image on the right. We can see the plasma membrane, that's the border that surrounds each cell. We can see the cytoplasm, it's the light pinkly stained interior. And then we can see the nucleus, almost dead center. All cells will have these three components, except for red blood cells. Red blood cells start out with all three components, but as they mature, they actually eject the nucleus and a lot of the organelles inside of the cell degrade. So a mature red blood cell actually doesn't have a nucleus, but it'll have everything else. The extracellular matrix surrounds all of the cells. It can be liquid, or it can be a thick gel, or it can even be solid. Okay, but it surrounds the cells in a tissue. And the substance binds the cells together and influences their function. It also provides tissues with strength to resist stretching and pressing forces. And a lot of that strength comes from the fact that the extracellular matrix has lots of protein fibers in it. So when we get to lab next week, we'll talk about the different protein fibers, and in lecture we'll talk about their functions, but they're kind of they're suspended in the extracellular matrix. And then the other part that's not protein fiber, that's in this particular drawing, it's this kind of aqua, watery blue looking material that's called ground substance. And it has nutrients, cellular wastes, minerals, as well as special polysaccharides suspended in it. The right side of this slide shows 3 examples of different epithelial tissues. Before we talk about what makes them different, let's talk about their similarities. Pause this video and write down a short list of things that look similar to you among the tissues. Then, when you're ready, press play and compare your list to my list of similarities. Got your list? All right. Here are some things that I noticed that are similar among the 3 images on the right side of the slide. The one thing that I notice is that the cells in each slide have a somewhat uniform shape. For example, all of the cells in this image here look roughly about as wide as they are tall. You see that? And they have a circular nucleus that's roughly in the middle of the cell. So all of the cells look kind of similar. Here, the cells look kind of like pancakes or fried eggs, but again, roughly the same shaped nucleus in the middle of the cell. Okay. Down here at the bottom, we have what look kind of like rectangular shaped cells, if we follow their plasma membranes, with oval shaped nuclei towards the bottom of the cell. Do you see that? So the cells have roughly the same shape. The other thing I notice is that the cells are very, very close to each other. In this slide in the middle, this image in the middle, you can see that the plasma membranes for adjacent cells look like they are the same thing. They're not. They're just super close together. Same thing here at the top. Look here. Here's the plasma membrane that separates this cell from this one. Again, very close together. We can't really distinguish them. Same thing down here at the bottom, although it's not as easy to see because the plasma membranes are not as distinguishable. But if you look closely, like right here and right here, you can kind of see where the plasma membrane is. And you can't differentiate between the plasma membrane of one cell and the ones adjacent to it. The other thing I notice is that there's very little ECM separating the cells. Remember, that's the material, can be liquid, solid, jelly-like, but it has fibers, protein fibers in it, and it's supposed to separate the cells. Not really seeing a lot of that here anywhere. The other thing I notice, the last thing that I notice, the fourth thing, is that if you look at the bottom of these cells, it's almost like they're sitting on a shelf. Do you see that? Here you can see it maybe a little bit better. Same thing down here. There's almost like an invisible border that separates the purpleness of the cells from the blue of the other tissue type that's below them. This is called the basement membrane, and epithelial tissues are always going to have a layer of cells that sit on the basement membrane, and that basement membrane separates the epithelial tissue from other tissue types nearby. So these are the things that I noticed. Now let's compare epithelial tissues to a couple of other tissue types. At the bottom of your slide on the right, this is an epithelial tissue. You just saw it on the last slide. In the middle is nervous tissue, and at the top is an example of a connective tissue. Pause this video, make a list of the differences between the epithelial tissue at the bottom and the other tissue types at the top of the slide. Then we'll compare. All right, got your list? Okay, let's see. What are some differences between epithelial tissues and some of the other tissue types? One thing you might notice is that the epithelial tissues tend to have a uniform shape, so these cells down here are all roughly rectangular shapes. Compare that to what you see in the nervous tissue. There's different cell types, right? You can see these guys are the nuclei of some very tiny cells, but then there's a star-shaped cell right here in the middle that's very different. This is a neuron. So the cells aren't necessarily uniform in shape. Same thing up here. Here are some nuclei for cells that are in this tissue. And if you look closely, you'll see that some of the nuclei look kind of oval shaped, others look more circular, they're different sizes. The cells are not uniform. Okay. Something else you might have noticed is that the cells aren't as close together. So in epithelial tissue, the cells really appear packed, membrane to membrane. But up here and up here in the connective tissue, the cells are spaced out. There's a lot of that extracellular matrix between it. How do we know? Well, remember on the first slide where I was talking about extracellular matrix, I told you that there's either a jelly or a watery or a solid material that we called the ground substance, and then there were fibers, protein fibers in that. So here you get in the connective tissue at the top, you can see the protein fibers really well. They look like threads that run throughout the image. You can also see protein fibers in the extracellular matrix down here for the nervous tissue. They again appear a little bit like threads. This tells us that there's a lot of ECM in other tissue types. You don't see those same threads or even much ECM down here in the epithelial tissue. So that's also important to note. Notice also that the cells in the connective tissue at the top and the nervous tissue at the middle, they don't appear to be sitting in one plane. So the connective tissue down here at the bottom of the slide, all the cells look like they're sitting on a shelf, right? We called that the basement membrane. And all of the cells appear to be connected to that shelf, right? We don't see that up here in the other two tissue types. So that's another difference. No bottom border, no basement membrane. So at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that when we're trying to identify tissues, we want to look at two main things. The first is the types of cells in the tissue, and then the second thing is the quantity and the characteristics of the extracellular matrix. So for your epithelial tissues, you're going to look at cells that are, for the most part, uniformly shaped. It won't be perfectly uniform, but the cells will have roughly the same shape. So we're going to put uniformly in quotation marks here. For example, if you look at this tissue here at the top right, you can see that the cells are all kind of square shaped, kind of. If you look at the cells at the bottom, you can see they're all kind of rectangular shaped, and these ones in the middle all look kind of like a geometric fried egg. So the cell shapes are going to be pretty similar. The other thing we're going to look for is that the cells are going to be very, very close together. They're so close together that their plasma membranes look like they're shared by two cells. So there's going to be very, very little ECM, if any, to separate the cells. And that is very classically a characteristic of epithelial cells. And it kind of hints to their function as being protective. The other thing we're going to look at is that the bottommost layer of cells is going to look like it's sitting on a shelf. So we're going to notice one type of tissue on one side of the shelf and a different type of tissue on the other side of the shelf. This shelf is called the basement membrane, and it's secreted by the epithelial cells in the epithelial tissue, but it's also partly secreted by the connective tissue that supports the epithelial tissue. I'm not sure that I mentioned that earlier. I'm sure it's in the lecture notes somewhere, but your epithelial tissues are typically supported by a layer of connective tissue, kind of like what you see in the bottom of this slide here. This stuff out here that's in between these two tubules, it's also connective tissue. So now what I'd like to do is introduce you to a little bit of terminology just so that you're aware. When we talk about epithelial tissues, we usually talk about the cells in terms of their sides, and there's very specific vocabulary that we use. When we're talking about the bottom of the cell, so this side of the cell that's closest to the basement membrane, we're going to use the word basal, B-A-S-A-L. That means the bottom of the cell. So on this particular figure at the bottom right, the basal side of the cell is the one that's sitting on top of the basement membrane. The opposite side is called apical, A-P-I-C-A-L. That's the top side of the cell, and it's usually the free side that's not facing other tissues immediately. Now, when you have a structure like this one, where the epithelial tissue makes a circular structure like a tubule, then the basal side is going to be the one that faces away from the center of the tubule. You can see the basement membrane kind of forming the bottom layer of these cells as they make the tubule. So that's the basal side. And then the inside of the tubule here is called the lumen. And cells that face the lumen, that's the apical side. So all of this that you see here, this is the apical side of the cells. Now let's apply what you've learned. These are 6 images of tissues from the human body. 2 of these images contain epithelial tissues. On a sheet of paper, write the numbers 1 through 6, and next to the number for the image that has epithelial tissue in it, write the word yes. Press pause while you record your answers, and after you've got your answers, press play to see if you're right. Did you guess numbers 1 and 5? If you did, you're correct. Remember the 4 characteristics that we looked at. Roughly uniform cells, so most of the cells in the epithelial tissue here and the cells that are in the epithelial tissue here, they look kind of the same shape. They're roughly uniform. The other things we were looking for is that the cells are tightly packed together and that there's very little ECM visible. That's definitely true here. The cells are so close together that it looks like they share their plasma membrane. Classic characteristic of epithelial cells. The other thing that we were looking for is a basement membrane. So even though I've drawn over it in this upper image in number 1, you can see the basement membrane right here supporting this epithelial tissue. The basement membrane in the bottom slide is a little harder to see because it's actually out of frame, but there would be one here as well. So hopefully you got 1 and 5. The rest of these tissues are all connective tissues, and we'll look at them when we get to the video on connective tissue. So in this video, we tried to distinguish epithelial tissues from other tissues by sight. We talked about 4 characteristics to help you with that, and we got a little practice looking at tissues. You will have to do this on your lab quiz, so if you don't have this skill yet, it's something that you'll want to develop before you get to that quiz. If you have any questions about identifying epithelial tissues, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm here to help you to be able to see these things. Don't be frustrated if you don't see it yet. Identifying tissues and looking at histological slides is a skill that you have to develop. It comes in time.